Well, I'm delighted to welcome you to the 2012 annual Robert H. Litowitz Lecture in Ethics and Public Policy. This year, as Nicholas just said, in fact, today, on this very day, we celebrate or remember the 22nd anniversary of Bob's death. It's a special occasion, therefore, for many of us, and we're particularly fortunate to have with us Bob's mother, Mrs. Gertrude Litowitz, and his sister, Lori Litowitz, and some friends of his and the family from New York. Some of us here knew Bob Litowitz, and we're glad for the occasion to remember and honor him today. We knew Bob as a remarkable man who came to Yale Divinity School while he was still a student at Columbia Law School. He was one of the world's genuine seekers. He wanted in particular to pursue questions that cross disciplines and that bridge religious traditions and diverse cultures. He was brilliant, creative in multiple ways, as a storyteller, an inventor, a craftsman, a businessman, and a scholar. He was a deep thinker, troubled by what he considered deficiencies in American educational structures, convinced that interdisciplinary approaches are essential to contemporary learning and the guidance of contemporary society. So when he was diagnosed with cancer, while still a student here at Yale, he established a charitable trust whose aim would be to support interdisciplinary research, teaching, and scholarship in ethics and social policy. This lecture series represents some of the fruits of his concerns, and as the years go by, I think we here at Yale appreciate more and more the wisdom of Bob's insights and the values of his actions. Thank you.
Let me tell you, I'm delighted to be here, and I want, first of all, to thank the Litowitz family for their sponsorship of this lecture, which means a great deal to me and is a great honor, and I'm really delighted to be here. I also would like to thank the students, the EPE students who read my book and took part in the Meet the Author series. I'd like to thank Professor Sambanis. I'd like to thank Erica de Bruin, Kellyanne Farnham, and I'd like to thank Professor Farley for starting today's events. I propose today to talk a little bit, to take what looked like Europe's biggest problem a few years ago and link it to what looks like Europe's biggest problem today. That is, when I started working on immigration, it appeared that the failure in Europe to create a multi-ethnic, multicultural society was the continent's most serious problem. I think it still may be the continent's most serious long-term problem. Nonetheless, it's a problem that's been driven out of the news to some degree by the economic emergency following the financial crash of 2008. I have a sense, and I've had a sense for a while, that these crises are related. Most obviously, they're related. They are demographic problems. Europe's need for unprecedented mass immigration and the precariousness of its state budgets, these are both the function of demographic change, of populations that are shrinking, not reproducing themselves, aging. You have a smaller workforce, and mass immigration and budgetary shortfalls are two pretty inevitable results of that. Both, though, and here's a second thing that I'd like to focus on a lot today, both are problems of hidden costs. And shortly after my book was published in England, an interviewer on the radio there spoke to me to describe my book as The Case Against Immigration. Now, I reject that description, but I do see what he was getting at. if the book concerns anything, it's that immigration has costs and benefits. The benefits tend to be immediate and measurable. The costs tend to be intangible, complicated, and pushed back to the future. They involve things like the erosion of democracy, the drift away from certain rights, the redefinition of the relations between states and peoples, and these are these things that we've come to call, in the years since the finance crisis, the things that we've come to call off-balance sheet liabilities. So this afternoon, I hope to make a few observations about both problems. First, I'll talk about immigration and multi-ethnic societies, and then I'll shift suddenly and jarringly to a discussion of the euro, and I'll try to tie both those things together. And since tying them together is something that I would appreciate your help in thinking about, then we can open the floor and sort of talk about this a little bit. Now, people in general who are interested in immigration questions tend to be Manicheans. They view immigration and all migration as either as a way to proclaim that we should all love each other more, or as a way to say that the world is going to hell in a handbasket. And although my book does have a simple theme, that you cannot have the same Europe with different people, I do not think it's a Manichean approach. I have never intended to lecture Europeans on what sort of society they ought to create under conditions of globalizations. I'd rather try to write from a critical distance and to ask what kind of Europe is going to result from decades of mass immigration, and whether that kind of Europe is going to be acceptable to Europeans. Now, if you take this critical distance, I think that you can see a typology at work in the immigration problems of all European countries. Native Europeans are proud of their diversity. Immigrants to Europe are proud of their diversity. Both blame the problems of integration, the problems that immigrants have with natives and vice versa. Both blame these problems on particular parochial things in individual countries, like if only such and such a minister hadn't been so lenient with asylum applications when he was in power, or if only this home secretary hadn't been so harsh, he wouldn't have created such resentment among immigrant populations, or if only we'd got those hard-working immigrants from country X instead of the delinquent ones from country Y, or if only we hadn't joined the European Union, or if only we'd stayed out of the Iraq War, there wouldn't have been so much resentment. And the impression left is that the immigration population in Europe is a diverse phenomenon and the product of local accidents. But I think that it's not. Structurally, Europe's immigration situation is not particularly diverse, even if the people and the countries involved in it are. And I think if you understand how immigration, Islam, and native European cultures interact in any Western European country, you have a kind of a rough and ready prediction of how they're going to react in most other ones. No matter what that country's national character, no matter whether it conquered an empire, no matter what its role in World War II, its relationship to fascism, its role in the Iraq coalition, and no matter where its Muslim immigrants come from. You get roughly the same arguments about the veiling of women, about anti-Semitism, about whether certain groups foster terrorism. These are problems in every European country. And the solutions that people try to come up with have a certain family resemblance. There are certain quirks among European immigrant issues. I mean, during the Iraq War, for instance, I recall that the Muslim population of Sweden, which contains a large number of Iraqi Kurds, was arguably more pro-American than the country at large. Britain differs from continental countries in that it's foreign policy rather than gender relations that is the main sticking point between Muslims and non-Muslims. France differs from other countries in not only in that it's had recent riots, but also that it's the only country that's really winning a significant number of immigrants over to what you might think of as an American-style patriotism. But in its broad outline, these problems of immigration, integration, and the multicultural society are the same in all Western European countries. All countries have the same aging, shrinking populations, the same need for unskilled labor. All countries make the same diagnoses of their immigration challenges, and they put forward the same economic and social policies. And once we take this perspective, I think it's easier to address immigration as a basic transaction that has benefits, which are mostly upfront, and costs, which arrive mostly over the long haul. Now, a straightforward way of making this cost-benefit analysis, I think, is the one done by the Oxford demographer David Coleman. Coleman has urged that when we tally up the economic impact of immigration, we also consider, and he says, quote, the total costs of the integration process and of the associated immigration and race relations businesses, the costs of meeting the special education, health, and housing needs of immigrants, the net effects upon the education of ordinary children in immigrant areas, the permanent need to regenerate urban areas of immigrant settlement instead of demolishing them, issues of crime and public order, and the multiplier effect on future immigration. I would say, if anything, that is too narrow a definition of the consequences of immigration. But that last item about the multiplier effect of immigration does approach the main hidden cost of immigration that Europeans have only recently begun to understand, and that is that a commitment to mass immigration means a commitment to long-term mass immigration. And if you understand that, you can understand why immigration has continued through the decades in Europe, even though public opinion in Europe has been steadily and overwhelmingly against it. And I would say that this has been a very dangerous thing for democracy in Europe, that you've had this overwhelmingly unpopular phenomenon which has done nothing but increase. Now, why should this be? Why should Europe have so much, decade after decade of mass immigration? Well, accounts of the benefits of immigration often describe the jobs that immigrants take as jobs no European wants. Now, what's really meant is jobs no European wants at a particular wage. Recently, the immigration specialist, Philip Martin of the University of California at Davis, drew a very interesting parallel between today's migrants and settlers of European colonies in the 18th century. Back then, migrants paid the cost of their resettlement through an indenture. You know how that works. They promised a given number of years of labor to the landowner who fronted their voyage. And Martin speculated that perhaps today's immigrants pay an updated kind of indenture in the form of rights, living as they often do in an ambiguous legal status that condemns them to only the lowest jobs and very few legal protections. Now, if there really are jobs that Europeans won't do at any price, this indenture is a big part of what natives believe they are getting out of immigration. And it does resemble the situation in the United States. We often hear people say they prefer legal to illegal immigration. But in fact, it's the illegal immigrants who are the real bargain for the society as a whole. They are the people who work at wages that make possible the 99-cent burgers on the value menu down at the fast food shop. Now, whether or not this indenture is fair, well, it depends on the context in which you view it. On one hand, the arrangement is corrosive. It's corrosive of democracy and fellow feeling because it creates two tiers of rights in in the destination country. On the other hand, the immigrants themselves are not likely to complain. They are doing better than they would have done in their native countries. But there's a hitch to this, because the benefits of this indenture, they accrue to immigrants, new countries, to the countries where the immigrants go, only so long as the immigrants are illegal and transitional. And immigrants don't stay that way forever. As soon as immigrants are legally and socially assimilated in a way that society professes to want, they acquire all sorts of rights and expectations. They become, in the case of Europe, they become Europeans, who then by definition won't do the jobs that no European wants. And then you need a whole new batch of immigrants. So the moment, and this is a terrible paradox, that the moment immigration is successful socially, the main economic reason that society thinks it needs immigrants vanishes. And at that point, in order to ensure that these jobs nobody wants gets done, you have another cycle of recruitment. And so the faster and more thoroughly immigrants adapt to your society, the more immigrants you need. Another way to look at this, I would say, is social rather than economic. And it will take you to the same conclusion. And that is the same conclusion that once immigration becomes your policy, it becomes a self-perpetuating policy. Look at diversity. Okay, everyone praises diversity, but where diversity is the result of an immigration, there is a similar illogic. If diversity enriches and strengthens nations as much as people claim, why would any nation want its immigrants to integrate into the broader society? Because in fact, that would be drawing down this fund of diversity, which is so valuable. And yet, we know people immigrate. We couldn't stop them from integrating even if we wanted to. And what a grim life they would have if they did not. So we know that immigrants integrate. And if diversity is indeed our need, we need to replace that, replenish that disappearing diversity with more immigration every generation. That supply of new churning must be kept on tap. And so you have and this is the paradox that I'm talking about, is that Europe has become a country in which large-scale immigration is both supposed to make countries different through diversity and supposed to leave them the same through integration. Now, what does this ultimately mean? It means that Europe is becoming a society on the American model. It's becoming a nation of immigrants. You might assume that this is like just an empty cliche or a historical fact. You know, all our parents came from other countries. America's a nation of immigrants. And I used to think that myself, but it's not an empty cliche. It's a profound ethos to be a nation of immigrants. A nation of immigrants is not just a nation that gets foreigners or is good at giving foreigners a nice place to stay. A nation of immigrants is a country that is willing to be changed by foreigners. And our country, it's a country that has consented to undergoing a permanent demographic revolution. And that is what our country is. But I've got to tell you, that sounds a lot better to us than it does to Europeans. They have always considered the Americanization of their continent, which has been proceeding not just via immigration, but also via television and advertising and American corporations, very visibly for the last half century. They've always considered this Americanization a kind of a Faustian bargain. All the stuff that Europeans have traditionally admired about America, the dynamism, the energy, the unpredictability, the lack of hang-ups, the freedom from class, Europeans are going to get that. But all the things that Europeans have traditionally disliked about the United States, the impermanence, the people running around who are indifferent to what their grandparents did, and their indifference to whether their the rules under which their children lived are, who determines those rules? All that impermanence and transience that Europeans associate with America, they're going to get that too. And I think that most Europeans do not realize, even now, that they have embarked on this journey that America continues to take. They do not necessarily, they have not necessarily accepted that it's permanent, and they don't feel they've consented to it. And that's a very big, that is the biggest of the hidden costs of immigration. Now with that, here comes my sudden turn. With that, I would like to turn to the economy, and specifically the crisis of the euro. Mass migration, as I say, is one symptom of a rapidly globalizing world. The European Union's experiment in multinational government, or more appropriately governance, and monetary union is another such experiment. Like mass immigration, the consolidation of the European Union has its upsides and its downsides. And just as with migration, while the upsides tend to be immediately evident, the downsides emerge over time. I'm afraid that the downside of the European crisis may involve serious damage to the democracies of various European countries, and may involve, in fact, an exit from democracy. As newspaper readers know, the European Union's shared currency, the euro, is in crisis. The euro created a problem. It tethered these dynamic, not particularly creditworthy economies like Ireland and Spain, together with one especially sluggish and predictable economy, which was Germany, as it used to exist, which was back in the 90s sort of struggling under the weight of reunification. The euro took a set of rules that were appropriate for a bunch of old people or nuns and applied them to a bunch of teenagers or emerging economies, let us say. So the result in the best of cases, as in Spain or Ireland, was a housing boom that was even more excessive than that of the United States, but without the reserve currency, which has given us a great deal of flexibility in getting out of it. In the worst of cases, where this boom economy combined with actual political corruption, as in Greece, well then the money didn't even go into anything so real as real estate. But in Greece, it went into the replacement of Greece's native economy with an import economy, and an economy that ran pretty much on tourism. Now, in both cases, these struggling countries have been deprived via Europe of the main instrument that countries have traditionally used to dig their way out of financial messes, and that is devaluation. The economists who said that you can't unite countries in a single currency unless you unite them under a single central government, they have been proved right. So, so how did we get here? As we contemplate this macroeconomic storm that's passing through Europe, we should bear in mind that it's a storm that the builders of the European Union knew would arrive. The designers of the euro understood Rahm Emanuel's philosophy about not letting a crisis go to waste. I mean, Jean Monnet, who has claimed to be one of the handful of the founding fathers of the euro, said, "Europe will be forged in crises, and it will be the sum of the solutions brought to these crises." So when the French statesman Jacques Delors laid out his plan for the euro in the late 1990s, he drew a clear trajectory. He said a common market had made possible a common currency, and a common currency would make possible a common government. But you have to ask yourself, how would that happen, and why? If contrary to what history has taught. It proved possible to have a currency that was not under the control of any one state. Well then, I mean, if this worked fine, if the euro worked fine, then there would be no reason to change the existing governing arrangements. Institutional change of the sort that the euro's founders sought could result only from the currencies getting into trouble. So, you know, you can see that this economic crisis kind of looks like an accidentally on purpose kind of pretext for a consolidation of power in Brussels. And so the European Union at its start, as I say, has from its start, it has brought us to that point. Now, I don't think the idea that Europe has grown less democratic as a result of the financial crisis should be controversial. But in case it is, I would like to offer a few different ways of measuring it. And the first is the increasing prominence of so-called fiscal union in the list of solutions to the crisis. Fiscal union means the harmonization, at the very least, the mixing, increasingly as it's talked about, the mixing of state budgets. What it basically means is having prudent countries or credit surplus countries cover the debts of credit deficit countries. And this sounds good, you know. It sounds like international cooperation. It sounds like a way of taking a solvent country like Germany and putting it together with an insolvent country like Greece and getting two solvent countries instead of one. The problem is that there's little agreement between northern and southern countries about how this will happen. For Germany, fiscal union basically means sending German fiscal policemen to impose austerity on Mediterranean governments. For southern European countries, fiscal union means getting helped out by transfer payments from northern Europe, which are not going to come. In short, northern countries want a euro government, and southern countries want a euro bond. They want a common European financial instrument. However it happens, this is a crucial step in building the EU. One of these two things is going to happen. It's the moment the founders of Europe were waiting for. But what it means is a removal of budget authority from national parliaments, not just in crisis times, but in ordinary times. And an entity that is without control of a budget is, most of us would say, not a state. So fiscal union, however you arrive at it, does mean disbanding the countries that make up the EU. And that's not the way it was sold. And you can see why people are going into the streets in some of these countries, particularly in Greece. Now, the second way you might see this is that you can see that the second way you see a retreat from democracy is through the replacement of elected leaders with unelected ones. Increasingly, over the past winter, you know, you've seen this progression. The first example is in Italy, the way Silvio Berlusconi was removed from power in the fall. You know, like him or not, like his ways with women or not, he was the democratically elected Prime Minister of Italy, enjoying full constitutional legitimacy. I think it's worth adding that as an economic matter, although he didn't do too much right in terms of fiscal policy, he didn't do that much wrong either. Italy has very low deficits, and its debt is roughly where it was when Berlusconi came to power in 1994. The only bad thing is that Italy was in a terrible mess in 1994, and it's pretty much in the same terrible mess now. What Berlusconi did wrong is that he confounded the EU's attempts to use the European Central Bank to resolve Italy's crisis. Late last summer, when the ECB, when the European Central Bank bought Italian state debt to drive Italy's interest rates down to sustainable levels, Berlusconi agreed to structural reforms, and he then reneged on those reforms. Now, this was a terrible thing to do, for which Berlusconi ought to have been held accountable by the Italian voting public. But instead, he was held accountable by Germany and France. The German Chancellor Angela Merkel spoke to the Italian president, who's generally a figurehead, but became an acting head of state. In this case, Giorgio Napolitano is his name, who appointed Mario Monti, a prominent economist, senator for life. He's probably the most famous person to hold that title since General Pinochet. He then presented Monti to Italians as their take it or leave it next premier. Now, Monti is a first-rate economist. He's a gifted politician. As far as I know, he's a perfectly honest politician. But I think that the peripheral question of whether Monti is a better guy than Berlusconi, or whether you trust him more than Berlusconi, should not distract us from the primary question, which is that Italy had a democratically elected government last summer, and now it has a semi-democratic government. Now, at about the same time that Italy's that Berlusconi was being replaced, Greece's premier, George Papandreou, was being removed. Now, even with a big write-down of its debt, it's likely that Greece owes more money than it can reasonably hope to repay. If this latest write-down plan works absolutely perfectly, the estimates are that Greece will still owe 120% of its GDP and in 10 years from now, and that very well might be unsustainable. In early November, Europe's leaders presented Papandreou with a plan to stop the country's finance crisis. Papandreou, it's important to note, did not say no, but he did say that he would like to ask his country for permission through a referendum on a decision that's going to bind them actually for generations. At that point, the European Union's leaders, not its duly constituted leaders, but Nicolas Sarkozy and Angela Merkel again, speaking as heads of individual nations, they offered Greece the choice between remaining in the Eurozone and replacing Papandreou with some kind of more acceptable governor. And that's how we got Lucas Papademos as president of Greece. There was a coda to that episode, and it's about a month ago, and it comes out of the fact that Greece is supposed to have elections next month. About a month ago, Germany's finance minister, Wolfgang Schäuble, suggested on a German radio show that Greece postpone its elections, which are due next month, as I say, in order that a technocratic government along the lines of Italy be allowed to carry out the reforms. So, given this tendency towards semi-democratic governments, I think it is not surprising that the project of building the EU no longer commands anything like the popular support that it had during the Cold War. The support for the EU has had its ups and downs. I would say in the 1950s there was a lot of skepticism about handing over power. I would say that roughly between the entry of Britain into the EU in the mid-70s and the Maastricht Treaty in the 1990s, there was a genuine legitimacy, there was a genuine will on the part of the leaders of other nations to hand over sovereignty. But I think that has been absent for at least the last 7 years. In 2005, the EU asked its citizens to approve the transfer of a large amount of political power explicitly from the national governments to Brussels through a constitutional referendum. And the repudiation of European publics was decisive. I mean, the French, this was the most intense political discussion the French had since 1968, possibly since the war. And they voted against further consolidation of European power by 55%. The Dutch voted against it by almost 2-1, and after that, Europe canceled all the remaining referenda. And yet, now this is where I'm going to tie it into immigration, and yet none of this has done anything to retard the moving forward of the European project. We spoke, we spoke earlier about how immigration creates the need for immigration. Well, in much the same way, the European Union creates the need for more European Union. This is sort of like, it sort of reminds me of the cat in the hat. You know, the European Union is an institution that creates problems that only it can solve. And I think that even most opponents of the euro see that this is a sort of that the dynamic is moving away from the nations and towards more centralization of power in Europe. Last fall, I was in Munich. I spoke to Peter Gauweiler. He's a politician in the Christian Social Union, and he has a reputation of being maybe the most anti-Euro politician in Germany. And yet he said he thought it would be very hard for Germany to get out of the euro. He said he thought Germany should never have gone into the euro. But then when I asked him, well, should it then pull out? He said, I don't know. And I said, well, isn't that an inconsistency? He said, no. And he quoted some proverb to me. He said, just because you can make a fish soup out of an aquarium does not mean you can make an aquarium out of a fish soup. So now what ties these two things together? I don't usually use this kind of vocabulary when I talk about politics, but I think that the euro crisis and the immigration crisis are both members of a family of crises of democratic capitalism. The euro crisis and the immigration crisis, they both have something in common with various banking crises. And one of the most extraordinary interpretations I've read over the past few years of what's going on is by the German sociologist Wolfgang Streeck, who runs a Max Planck Institute in Cologne. And while he's a sociologist, he's also an economic thinker, I think, of great subtlety. Now, in two recent articles in the New Left Review, he laid out an interesting thesis, which is that in a free market democracy, you have a conflict between two ways of allocating goods. There's market allocation and there's political allocation. The bluntest possible way of describing the consequences is to say that the politicians who get elected are usually the ones who most credibly offer a free lunch. Now, I'm not usually someone who finds himself bobbing his head up and down in agreement as I read the New Left Review, I can assure you. But one of the things I do like about Streeck is his willingness to question certain social democratic shibboleths. For instance, he admits that the high wages of the late labor union heyday were, he doesn't say they're a bubble, but he does say this. He says government's commitment to full employment, together with a growing welfare state, protected trade unions from potential employment losses caused by wage settlements in excess of productivity growth. What he's trying to say is labor unions were able to get through political muscle more than they could have got in the open economy. And what basically happened is you had to offer people both what they could get through the economy and what they could get through politics. You basically needed to win an election, you needed to be able to give people, although this is me saying this, not Streeck, you needed to be able to give people $1.50 worth of services for $1 worth of taxes. The world Streeck describes is a world in which no government can long stay in power unless it offers people this sort of increment, which you can call something for nothing. When trade union demands began to break business in the 1970s, government stepped in with a solution. It increased, or let's say in the 60s and 70s, government stepped in to offer various welfare state entitlements in exchange for trade union moderation. When these entitlements themselves began to burden the state in the 1970s, governments then tried to inflate them away. When inflation slowed down the economy in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the government fixed that problem, but only by running huge deficits. And when big deficits began to scare markets, governments paid them off. But at the same time they did so, they deregulated banking, allowing voters to replace public with private debt. And the final stage is what we saw in the vote on the Troubled Asset Relief Program in 2008, where democratic states turned into what Strake calls, quote, debt collecting agencies on behalf of a global oligarchy of investors, compared to which C. Wright Mills's power elite appears a shining example of liberal pluralism. But I think that we might all find something to disagree with politically there, but I think that his basic point that inflation, public debt, and then private debt all made it possible to, quote, introduce resources into the distributional conflicts of the time that had not yet been produced, enabling governments to draw on future resources in addition to those already on hand. I think we can agree that that's sort of what has happened to us. And I think it's what happened to Europe. And I think that a lot of the policies, I think, of recent decades have been not rescues, but false rescues. With the benefit of hindsight, I would say that mass immigration, for all its benefits, belongs to this family of false rescues that Strake describes. The positive jolt to the economy from cheap wages was recognized very quickly, and to some extent it continues. This is not a dead loss, but the high cost of integrating immigrants, a cost not just in money but in rights and disrupted habits, that's something that would not come due until later. So probably if you looked carefully at immigration 5 years ago, you might have seen the finance crisis coming. There, as in banking, democratic sentiment called for one thing, which was a curtailment of immigration, while financial sentiment called for another, which was a continuation of immigration. Immigration, too, draws on future resources to solve present-day distributional conflicts. It, too, belongs to this policy idea, this family of policy ideas, in which the benefits are obvious, but the costs are off balance sheet, to use an expression that's become unfortunately familiar of late. And that is about all I have, and I thank you very much.
We can open up the question. You can take
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Happy to. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much for a very stimulating argument.
Yeah.
I want to challenge you a little bit by following your train of thought, but giving it a different direction. In a sense, what you are arguing is that both immigration and democracy share this kind of problem in which you promise more than you can actually deliver, and as a result you create troubles for the future. Now, for democracy, that produces a paradox, which is the incredible resilience of democracy. That is, if democracy suffers from this kind of imbalance, we would observe democracies collapsing much more often than we do. And one of the very surprising facts of modern history is that once democracies cross a certain threshold of income, which is quite low, is the income of Argentina in '77, they actually survive. They never fall back. So there is a contradiction here, which is that the outcome does not correspond to what we would expect given the fundamental weakness that you identify. And if that is true, and there may be good reasons to think about why democracies survive, then we may also push the analogy to your other question, immigration, and maybe we could say that, well, there is perhaps a way in which you can get this problem of immigration with its imbalance of costs and benefits to actually not cause the kind of very pessimistic outcome that we may possibly think. There may be an optimistic twist that we connect the two issues very much that you argue there is a pessimistic one that connects them.
Yeah.
And so I want to push you in that direction. And also I would like to get your reaction to a small qualification of your description of the democratic deficit due to the euro crisis. You obviously know that these are parliamentary governments, and therefore, this is why you mentioned the semi-democratic as opposed to the non-democratic governments, in that Berlusconi is not elected directly. It is the parties, in a sense, that elect the prime minister, and insofar as the parties give the confidence to, say, Prime Minister Monti, you can have a fully democratic, typically or procedurally kind of outcome, even though I would agree with you that from a symbolic or legitimation point of view, it's very problematic. However, it is not unusual, and it is not necessarily because of this external intervention that you had parties accepting this bargain. But if you look at prior very big crises in Europe, say the transition from the 4th to the 5th French Republic, you had a situation in which political parties accepted, in a sense, to coalesce around an unelected or not directly legitimate leader precisely to overcome the crisis. And I would argue that the reason why we observe those outcomes this time is not so much because of the external pressure, but because the alternative was so terrible, and parties understood that the alternative was extremely costly. And that, I think, qualifies slightly the idea that you have a totally sort of rupture of the democratic compact. And I think it's worth also reflecting on.
Okay. Well, that's really, I mean, that's enough to talk about for the next hour, okay? On democracy, you know, I'm not sure, I'm not sure I buy these hard and fast rules about democracy, because I think, you know, that we used to hear, you know, before the Iraq War that, you know, no two countries with a McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other, or no two democracies have ever gone to war with each other. And I think that that can be very illusory, because I think that when countries go to war with one another, they usually, before that, they shift out of being a democracy. I think, I don't know what the income, what the per capita income is for losing, you know, what that threshold you're talking is. But I think that if it were inflation adjusted, I think you'd find that a lot of countries probably went out of democracy, you know, between the French Third Republic and the early part of the 20th century, including France, you know. So I'm not comfortable I'm not as confident that Europe's going to inevitably stay at the same level of democracy. Your last point about the and part of the reason has to do with your last point about the democratic deficit. You're quite right that semi-democratic rather than non-democratic is the best description of the Italian government. I mean, Monti. The problem with Monti is that he was appointed by the president, and that may be a presidential power, but it's an emergency power. It's not the kind of thing that you expect to see in a well-functioning democracy. The vote by the National Assembly is obviously a legitimate one. He was obviously chosen prime minister by the legislature. It's the way he got into, you know, government as being named a senator for life that is I think the irregularity. What you say about how this is internal rather than external pressure, I think is a good point. There are, you know, a lot of these European countries, and there's a kind of an original sin in the way some of these European nation states went into the European Union. I think that a lot of these countries, including Italy, Italy under Prodi was certainly this way. A lot of these countries expected to get out of Europe cover for making fiscal adjustments that they didn't have the votes to make anyway. So basically they wanted to make cuts, they wanted to raise taxes, they wanted to close budget gaps, but they didn't think their people would let them do it. And they were able to go to their people and say, the European Union is forcing us to do this, and you know, we're going to be kicked out of the big league. And so I think that there was an anti-democratic impulse in it, I think, as that happened. Now, the question that you asked about whether there's a more this question of is this a problem actually that I'm describing here of democracy? This idea that you need to get, $5 in benefits for every $4 you pay in taxes. Perhaps it is. I mean, to a degree, but I do think that a more optimistic reading is possible. For instance, I do not think that the United States has, although it's got very similar fiscal position to the worst countries in Europe, I don't think that my analysis of the immigration problem in Europe holds for the United States, because I don't think that that immigration to the United States distorts the way our Constitution works, the way it does theirs. Constitution is the wrong word. The culture, there's a certain cultural capital that their societies are built on, and ours is built on a different kind of cultural capital. And that's what I was getting at when I said that we are content to be changed by new waves of people. I don't know that they are. And that's what makes their society different than ours as far as this problem is concerned. Yes, sir?
Thanks for the fascinating lecture and for combining politics and economics and ethics. Most academics are way too timid to do that, included. But I wanted to ask you whether, isn't your analysis of the cause of the antagonism to immigration an economic one, in the sense you're saying immediate benefits but long-term problems? But it seems to me that most of the backlash is really cultural, which is, you also suggest at the same time.
Yeah.
So I think there's a contradiction here in terms of your causal critique, which is immediate benefit. You think people would say, great, we like this.
Right.
Long-run problem, primarily economic, you would say.
No, I think the long, because
my feeling now is that there's most of the reaction today is about Islam. It's a very complex one, and it has to do with the place of course, Christianity there, but also a whole set of cultural, which they're gradually facing more and more and more. I don't, even though much of the language is economic, there's a lot of cultural language.
Yeah. You hear the first article I did on immigration was in the 1990s. Mid-1990s, I did a piece for the Atlantic Monthly. I went to Marseille. I met with some Algerian French people who are running a charity. They gave mittens to people in Algeria. They were devout Muslims. This was before any of this 9/11 happened or anything like that. And it was so they were much more open. It was a nice time to meet with people back then. But they said something that I never forget. They said, well, our parents came because the French people needed factors of production, and they got people instead. I've heard that a lot of times since, but I've never really been able to improve on that as a description of what the problem was. As factors of production, this immigration of the early 60s was a big success. As people to share a society with, if people said, you're going to save, you're going to save 50 centimes on the unit cost of labor per hour, but you're also going to have a country that is 1/4 Muslim forever. I don't think most French people would have accepted that deal, but they didn't think that these people were going to stay. They did not think of them that way, and that's what I guess I mean about. That's the sort of hidden cost I mean. That there's a dealing. You now have to deal with. In a sense, you've borrowed from the future democracy. I don't know that you've borrowed economic resources from the future. You borrowed political resources from the future. in exchange for rather short-lived economic gains. So I don't think it's a long-term. I don't think it's the long-term economic things that have been borrowed, and I tend to think that the price for I think the price of immigration tends to be paid in the form of a change of a change in social structures and folkways that would otherwise be undesirable to most people. Yeah. So, yes, Professor.
Follow up on this. The economic model of self-sustaining immigration that you mentioned is premised on the assumption that immigration is going to be low-skilled labor, the jobs that the Europeans don't want to do.
That's, yeah.
So my question is, how does that relate to the sources of opposition to immigration in Europe? Is it the case that most of the opposition comes from low-skilled Europeans who react to the cultural aspects of immigration, but in reality, it's the economic competition that immigration creates for them? Or are high-skilled upper economic classes also reacting to the cultural aspects of immigration? If it's not the latter, then I think the implications of your argument, the implications for your argument are negative, because
if the high-skilled are not reacting.
That's right. Because then it's not really a sort of inevitable cultural class that immigration creates, and it could be conceivably social programs and other government interventions to alleviate the economic causes of conflict that immigration creates. Right? So I guess the question goes back to this distinction between economic and cultural causes of
Yeah. Yeah, you know, you just said most academics don't dare to compare politics and economics, or don't dare to talk about both at the same time. Journalists tend to, it's a sort of maybe the fearlessness that comes with ignorance or something like that. But with that qualification, I think the dynamic of high income, the dynamic of high skill immigration and the dynamic of low skill, I think they're different. I mean, we live in a country where we need both, and I think that you know, probably the state of the school system probably has a lot to do with the country's need for high-skilled immigration, and the state of the demographic pyramid probably has a lot to do with the state of low-skilled immigration. But I think there is, you know, it's tough to measure, you know, who we're talking about when we talk about the competition, the native-born competition for immigrant or first or such second generation labor. It's my, you know, if we take let's say the National Front in France, which is not only a right-wing party, but also I think has a rather low demographic profile, I think you can see the stirrings of their discontent with immigration very early, even at a time when you were relatively close to full employment. So the cultural factor, there is something totally real to it. I think for certain Europeans of European background, it's a primary problem. I think for other Europeans, it's maybe a way that an economic competition is dressed up as being something a little more ennobled. And maybe that is what you see now. But I would not expect to see such a high level of success for anti-European parties. And remember, they're rising. They've risen in the last couple of years. It's kind of a mystery, you know, for two reasons. One, you have the economic crisis, which is a diversion from the problem of immigration. And two, you've had a fall in structural unemployment in a lot of these European countries. Certainly France and Germany. You know, I mean, Germany had 5 million. Well, let's focus on France. The French unemployment rate is lower than it was 10 years ago, and yet the National Front is stronger. So I don't know, but I see indications in both directions that it's that the economic is that the cultural is a primary concern, and that it's the way an economic concern is dressed up. Yes.
Question for the journalist reporter.
Yeah.
If you will.
Yeah.
So over the last, I guess, 15 years now, I've been accumulating degrees in American higher education with my PhD here at Yale. Studies an undergrad at Harvard University. And I've interacted with a lot of Europeans who come here as graduate students, postdocs, young faculty. And by that I mean mostly Germans in this case. And one of the critiques that I get from my German colleagues, and this is now about the American model of doing things, is the sort of the critique of our welfare state, how inadequate it is, how barbaric it is at times, how we don't take care of our middle class, and so on and so forth. And Europeans are very proud of their welfare states. This, 5-to-4 exchange that you brought up. Over the last 15 years or so that you've been covering Europe and Financial Times, has this European, German, Franco-German aversion towards Anglo-Saxon unbridled plutocracy intensified over the years, or have they sort of rethought some of their, a little bit of their model in these years?
It's funny, I'd say yes and no. Yes, they've rethought their model a bit. And if you look at Germany, if you look at the German hospital system, I mean, it used to be made up of all private rooms and things. Now people are doubling up in rooms. I mean, people, there have, particularly in Germany actually, if you look at the 2003 reforms, the reform that's called Agenda 2010 and the Hartz IV unemployment reform, that was a serious welfare state reform. Went considerably beyond what we did in 1996. And a lot of people say that's sort of the foundation on which a lot of the solidity of the German economy is built today. So they've been cutting. They even sort of, now that their age pyramid is unfavorable, they're going to have to cut further. And I think they are beginning to understand that. Actually, particularly in places like Italy, where you have a rapidly declining, the actual workforce in the country is declining in absolute numbers, which means that the per capita cost of a given sized welfare state is rising, even if you keep the state the same size, So yes, they realize that they have to change, but at the same time, they have not diminished one bit their sense that our system is barbaric, I mean, it's very rare that I meet a European who expresses anything but mystification at why anyone would oppose the Obama healthcare reform. You know what I mean? They just look at you and say, like, what is this about? It's an obvious question for them. So, actuarially, they know that they're in trouble. Ideologically, I think that they still think that these are, they still think their way is best. Yes, sir.
Yeah, could I come back to the issue of integration, cultural integration, and thinking about assimilation, integration, in particular with regard to immigrants who are Muslim. And as you look around Europe, do you see any differences in the extent of accommodation or non-accommodation? I was intrigued by the comment you made in passing about France, which is regarded by many countries to be obviously assimilationist, become French, and accept our secular culture, so forth. But do you see any any differences about that? And then, while I have you, I'll ask a second question about the EU and this recent treaty, and what do you think about balanced budgets? German debt breaks. So,
okay.
But I'm curious about the integration issue.
Okay. First, integration. Well, yes. Traditionally, there have been a variety of ways to negotiate this gap between the mainstream culture of these European countries and the culture of those who come into it. We were talking about it at lunch today. You know, the French have, for many, many years, had this, for centuries, had this idea of citoyenneté. You know, one is equal, and you know, and there's equal citizenship in everything. And the state owes equal treatment to all its citizens, but in return, the citizens owe it to the state to make each other, you know, to become like their fellow citizens. So, and that is not really a novelty. And I actually think it's not unrelated to the fact that the French, I mean, it might be repugnant to our Anglo-Saxon sensibilities to have a central government saying, you know, you're going to be like this. This is the kind of citizen you're going to be. You know, you're going to read Molière in the 8th grade and Rousseau in the 12th grade, and that, you know. But I think it has a lot to do with the fact that France is the only, I think thus far, the only country in Europe that has been able to provoke in or educe from its immigrants a sense of you know, a sense of this the sort of what we in America would recognize as patriotism. You know, I don't think it's a majority of North African immigrants to France who say, you know, La France, ma patrie, you know, but it's a sizable number, and it's enough people that you have to say France has been more successful at this than other countries. If I may just sort of throw out one idea, you know, I mean, I think that this French Republican citoyenneté idée is a powerful secular idea. Most secular ideas are not that strong. They're not as strong as French or American patriotism. They're kind of like, you know, I mean, in a lot of these liberal democracies in Europe, the you know, the culture is, well, I don't know, do what you want, you know, that kind of thing. There's no anything, and that's why I think in those cultures, the Netherlands is one of them. All right, we're not going to prescribe anything for you. In those cultures, in those cultures, I think Islam is viewed as more of a threat, because Islam actually is a religion, and as such, it offers something that societies lack. You know, so yes, there's a difference. I think these differences between European countries are closing. I would have said one of the biggest differences between neighboring countries was between Sweden and Denmark 5 years ago. But you know, Sweden's becoming much less easy come, easy go, and much more like what they called right wing when they looked at Denmark 5 years ago. Now, for your next,
could I just ask you about one aspect of this, just to follow up before you talk about debt break? Could you say something about multiculturalism and your view about that? One of the things in one of the lines in your book that was provocative, I was looking for it, couldn't find it, has to do with the fact that you know, Europeans may want to integrate people who don't want to be integrated, and I guess this comes back also to your French case. And you suggested that the immigrants, at least some portion of them, may have a strength of faith as well as cultural identity that they want to maintain their separate identity, including their religious identity, and don't want to be assimilated.
Yeah.
And could you say something about that as it relates to multiculturalism as another way, sort of the British style of dealing with this question of immigration?
Yeah, well, you know what? If we can just sort of step back from beating around the bush a little bit, you know, we talk about how great assimilation has worked in this country, and it has, you know. I mean, we've all become part of the same culture. But I think most of us in this room have the religion of our mother's 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 mother, going back to another continent. So assimilation works, but religion stays. And you know, right now we're in a period where there's a lot of, you know, evangelization and people are changing religion and things, but religion does have a durability, okay? And Islam right now is a kind of hot religion. It's a religion that is heavily evangelized. It's got a lot of really fervent believers. And here's the difference that we've never had. It's a religion that in several parts of the world is at war with the West. Now that doesn't mean that, you know, every member of the Muslim faith in Europe is at war with the West, but there's a confrontation between the West and Islam, obviously. I mean, that doesn't mean that every Westerner is at war with every Islam, but this is a problem that we have never faced in this society, which is a you know, a profound sort of religious allegiance that's maybe at odds with your national allegiance. And if you look at the difficulty John F. Kennedy had in getting elected in 1960, at the hoops he had to jump through, at the speech he had to make in Texas, at a time when, you know, his religion was the largest religion in the United States. I mean, these conflicts are bound to be bigger when there is such, you know, when there's not. I'm not just talking about things like the Iraq War. I'm talking about what happened in Toulouse the other day. I mean, with this guy in the banlieue. So that's that's obviously a big issue. Yes. So, oh, you wanted me to talk about debt breaks. All right. Well, you know, I'm not an economist, which is why I'm so comfortable talking about the economy. I think, to a certain extent, the Brussels Pact, to get into the boring detail of the European rescue, the Brussels Pact that was sort of negotiated in December without Britain and then ratified by 26 of the European countries in February, is a revisiting of the original European modus operandi for doing fiscal union. As I said, you know, I know I'm killing you. I know I know it's boring stuff, but I'm just kidding. No, have a good afternoon. No, but the you know, as I said, you can't have, you know, this thing that economists said, that you can't have a currency union without fiscal union. The Europeans really wanted to do this without a fiscal union, and they figured if they just converged their budget targets, they would be, if they would just harmonize the budget targets, that would work. It didn't work, and the imbalances that created the mess, except in Greece, but the imbalances in Spain and Ireland that created the euro mess were private sector imbalances. They were a function of money created by banks, of lent out money, not, you know, so-called printed money. So I don't think this is going to. It's not. You know, I think a balanced budget is a nice thing to have. I think, but I don't think that this is going to solve their problems. I guess. So, oh yes, sir.
Yeah, I guess I just wanted to push back on a couple of things. One was the idea that I suppose religious difference creates different kinds of challenges from other kinds of difference, like ethnic difference perhaps, that's not religious. And the second was on the exceptionalism of the US compared to Europe, and that things work differently here. So there's been a lot of work done by economists and sociologists looking at multi-ethnic societies of lots of different types. And one common finding seems to be that that multi-ethnicity just makes things more difficult. It leads to somewhat worse economic outcomes sometimes. You're less likely to trust others in more multi-ethnic societies. And these findings seem to be remarkably constant. They work in an all-black environment in Kenya, if you go and do economic studies there. When people have looked at support for school bond initiatives in the US or other kinds of public goods votes, they tend to go down as you get higher levels of diversity. And so one argument might be, okay, this is one particular instantiation of it in Europe with religion, but you see the same kind of dynamic happening more generally. The prediction might be that in Europe, not just because demography gets worse in the future, but also because it's going to become more diverse. Like the US, you'll see a similar kind of decline in support for the degree of social spending that they've got. So
Yeah, well, if I could link that to the earlier question about the welfare state, I mean, I think that one of the more interesting studies that you're probably talking about is the one by Alesina and Glazer, in which they have found that these are two Harvard economists who found that that the smallness of the American welfare state is about half of the cause of the smallness of it as compared to European countries is the ethnic diversity of the country. That people don't feel that they're giving their money to sort of kindred people. And so if what you say is right, then there is if there is an economic cost to diversity, there still it still may be something you want to have. If you want to have a diverse society, it might be something worth paying for. I wouldn't know how to measure it, and it's not the kind of it's not anything that I tried to quantify in the book or managed to do. I think that I guess there's also the Robert Putnam study on hunkering down or whatever, but yeah, that's interesting. When I was talking about borrowing from the future, I'm talking mostly about about political uncertainty rather than measurable economic loss. But there are circumstances in which they amount to the same thing. Yes, Professor.
Sorry to ask you a question.
Yeah. No.
So you said that your argument does not apply to the U.S.
Okay. All right. I guess I did say that. Yeah. No. It does. It applies in certain. There are certain places where you can see an overlap. Like I do think, as I say, that the U.S. model and the French model has something of the U.S. model in it, but I think that most European countries do not.
Right, but then you also said that most people's religions are those of their mothers,
Yeah.
and so on, right? In the U.S.
Yeah.
Therefore, and the problem that you highlight, the problem associated with immigration, the cultural conflict in Europe, you link to religious difference.
Yeah, I don't want to go too. I don't want to be too firm about that.
But you said
I don't.
Islam.
Yeah. Oh well. Look, I think that Islam is a problem. I don't link it to every problem with immigration.
Okay, but the point I'm trying to make is that the main difference that I can see between the United States and most European countries is that the cultural essence of the society that is so different between them is that one is based on ethnic nationalism in Europe, most countries in Europe, whereas it's civic nationalism in the United States. Not necessarily a religious difference or similarity that anchors cultural character of the two societies.
Yes.
And if that is so, why is the focus of the discussion on Islam? Why does it matter that the countries that the countries in the West are fighting Islamic, or countries where there are a lot of Muslim people, if those wars are not actually about religion? And why isn't it the case? Why couldn't Europe conceivably develop a more civic nationalist identity? I mean, they haven't done it so far, and it's difficult to do. But in principle, it can be done with the right institutions and the right approach.
Right. I think that because I think that that you know a devout a person who takes his Muslim either there are two ways to describe yourself as having a Muslim identity, right? You can have Muslim belief. You can be a religious believer, and that's not what I think most of this is about. I don't think it's about belief. I think it's about identity, really. I think that this identity can be just as, if you have a religious-based identity, you can be just as uneasy with someone else's civic nationalism as you can with someone else's ethnic or religious nationalism. I don't think that you need a rival religion as a rival. It can be a rival ideology of any kind, don't you think?
Yeah, I don't understand how that is. I don't see how that answers the question. Maybe I missed something.
Okay, lay the question on me again then.
So you were saying that the United States is very different from Europe, and it has been able to avoid these problems.
Right.
I was just trying to understand what role religion plays in framing that and explaining that difference. If actually what is really different between the two societies is that the source of nationalism and national identity in the United States is actually the civic identity, whereas in Europe it is an ethnic identity, not necessarily a religious identity.
Yeah. I think that I would agree with that in that, and I think that's what I was trying to say with a slightly different vocabulary when I said that I thought the United States was content to be a nation of immigrants rather than, you know, in a way that Europeans were not. To have, you know, large-scale immigration is consistent with civic nationalism more than with ethnic nationalism, almost by definition, right? Yeah. So. Yes, sir.
Just an economic question for you. I mean, the demographic problem of the decline of birth rate, isn't that a much more overriding problem than the need for cheap labor? In other words, there's two different political economic things. There's a desire for cheap labor to prevent, so you don't have to raise wages, but there's also a long-term problem of simply not being able to finance the state as the birth rate goes down.
That's right.
So there's going to be an insistence on keeping immigration.
Yeah, well, I don't know how it will work. You know, that varies over time, and you know, well, let's look at you know how demographics affects the position of these countries. You know, Italy has got a per capita debt that's about exactly the same as ours. Their debt to GDP ratio is about 100%, right? And so is ours. But we're growing fast. We've got 320 million people in the country. We're going to have 400 million at mid-century. At mid-century, we're going to be 25% bigger than we are now. Italy's going to be about 25% smaller, you know, and I think that shrinkage is going to be disproportionately in people of working age. So yeah, they're in big trouble. Now the question is, you know, immigration is a very short-term solution to that because immigrants are mortal too, right? They age, they require health care, they require pensions, and so I mean maybe it's a good short-term stopgap, But it's only going to help you in an absolute way if you assume they're all going to go back to their homelands before they retire, which is unlikely. Right?
Or if you bring in more young ones.
Bring in young ones, okay, but and their dependents too. You know, there's an interesting thing that happens when people stop having children, is that they get an actual increment in their they get a boost in their disposable income because they're not paying for children. So it's not, you know, the Europe is not about to have a come down from its sort of steady state, you know, spending habits. It's got a bit of a bonus. I mean, so it's the landing is going to be even harder than it would ordinarily be, you know.
So would this be a good argument for bringing Turkey into the EU?
I don't think so. I don't think because I don't think they've got a lot of young people for now, which means, but I mean that just means they'll have a lot of old people, and you know, in quicker than you realize. You know, it's funny how quickly you move from the beginning of your career to the end of it. But you know, but there's another thing I would say about Turkey, which is that it's, you know, Turkey's produced some terrific economists. Its record of emerging from bankruptcy, which is what, about 12 years ago. It's done a good job in the last 10 or 12 years. Nonetheless, its state accounts are not perfectly transparent, and I think that the experience of that Europe has had with the imperfectly transparent records in Greece is probably hurting, not helping, Turkey's chances of getting in.